Thank you, Matthew. This morning, I took it as one last opportunity before we get back into, our series on covenants, to address something I think really needs to be addressed at this time. I think there are a number here who are going through difficult times, a number of here who have family and friends who are going through difficult times, a number of you are just about to start school. There's just a lot that is going on right now. A lot of illnesses, a lot of trips, a lot of planning and things that are happening. And so I thought this morning we should just take some time and meditate on Psalm 23 to really see what this psalm is, what it's about, how it's so applicable to our lives today, and why it's such a popular psalm and has been for so long. It starts off with the words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And this idea of God being a shepherd, or his people being sheep, or even his servants being shepherds, it's very difficult to escape this concept when you read through your Bibles. As you read through from the Old Testament to the New Testament, you'll remember that Joseph's family, as they go into Egypt, they go there saying they are shepherds. You remember Moses, before he leads the people out of Egypt, he spends decades as a shepherd, preparing to be someone who can lead the people. You remember David is a shepherd before he becomes a king. And God is regularly referred to as a shepherd, or his servants are referred to as shepherds, and the people are referred to as his sheep. And this relationship helps us to understand our relationship to God. Now, I know an elder at a church who has raised sheep, and he would often comment about how dumb they are, and how he reads this and he feels a little insulted, and yet the truth is we're probably not as smart as we think we are. And we do need a shepherd. And this is a perfect description of our relationship to God. God is our shepherd. He leads us. He leads us to good places. He leads us through difficult times. And to be honest, the popularity of this psalm I find a little baffling. Because the psalm itself, number one, it doesn't say anything new. When David wrote this, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures," and all this was not a new idea. It's not like people hadn't heard this before. They knew about Moses being a shepherd. They knew Israel was a people of shepherds, a people of sheep. They knew that prophets had referred to God as the shepherd and the people as the sheep. They knew these things. So it's nothing new. And also, it's not quoted in the New Testament, which, again, is very, very baffling. It's so popular, and yet you don't find it in the New Testament. You may find ideas, concepts, or even things that kind of match up with it in the New Testament, but you don't find direct quotations. Like you do, for example, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, "Make ready or prepare the way for the Lord." We know that from the Old Testament because it's quoted in the New Testament. It's very popular because it's quoted in the New Testament. Or we know Jesus saying, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Out of all the laws in Deuteronomy and ideas, Jesus picks up on that one. And I'm not of the opinion that it was popular before then. I think Jesus saying it really then makes it stand out for us. But Psalm 23, so it's nothing new. It's not quoted directly in the New Testament. Why is it so popular? Why do so many people know it? People who have not read their Bibles, they've heard this in movies, in books, maybe at funerals. They've heard this read. Why is it so popular? I think it is probably so popular because we don't tire of hearing this. We don't grow tired of being reminded that God leads us, that God blesses us, that God takes care of us. These are timeless truths, things that everyone is going to have to go through. You will be led to green pastures, and you will be led through the valley of the shadow of death. These are timeless truths applicable to everyone. Whether you're a Christian or not, this still applies to you. Jesus says that God makes his rain fall on the just and on the unjust. God still leads people to green pastures, no matter who they are. I think this is so popular because these are things we need to hear. In fact, the psalm itself says in verse 3, he restores my soul. I think that's exactly what this psalm does for us. It restores our soul. It nourishes us. It's timeless because these are things we don't grow tired of hearing, because they're things we need to hear. We need to be reminded of these things. So I'd like us to spend some time then looking at this psalm and just taking time to meditate on it and to allow it to teach us and to nourish us. We'll start with verses 1 through 3. David writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake." So David starts us with a scene from the pasture. That there is a shepherd leading a sheep, and this shepherd, he comes out and says, is the Lord. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. And when you're young, I shall not want is very confusing. What does it mean I don't want God? But it means, obviously, I won't lack anything. I will not be in want of anything. I'd like us to look at the character of the shepherd and the character of the sheep to kind of see what we can glean from this. So who is this shepherd, and why does his actions help us so much? First of all, the shepherd is someone who is compassionate. That's the kind of shepherd we're dealing with. A shepherd who is compassionate. To understand compassion, it's really like a mix between kindness and sympathy and pity. This shepherd knows that the sheep don't know better. This shepherd knows that the sheep need to be guided because they'll go astray on their own. They won't find the green pastures by themselves. This is a shepherd who is compassionate, who looks at the sheep and says, I love them so much and they don't know better, but I'm going to be with them through all of this. That's the kind of shepherd we're dealing with. This shepherd gives guidance. In verse 2, he makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside still waters. This shepherd gives guidance to the sheep, and he guides them to good places. Just take a moment and think about that. This shepherd takes the sheep to good places. Not unpleasant places, although they may be unpleasant for a period of time. But these are good places the shepherd leads the people to, the sheep to. The shepherd leads the sheep. The shepherd even puts himself on the line. Look at verse 3. The second part there, he says, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. This is a shepherd who risks his own name, who risks his own possessions, his own identity. This is a shepherd with things on the line that are dependent upon how he takes care of the sheep. And David in this psalm wants us to know that this is God. This is the kind of God our God is. This is a God who knows that we don't know better. This is a God who knows that we make mistakes and that we stumble. This is a God who guides us to good places. Places where there are green pastures. Places where there are still waters. This is a God who puts himself on the line. You remember Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. That everyone else who has come before him, they don't care if the sheep die. But God cares. He cares about the sheep. He guides them to good places, and he has his own things on the line. He has things at risk if the sheep are not taken care of properly. This is the shepherd we are presented with. And I'd also like us to consider the kind of sheep that we're presented with. We are, first of all, presented with sheep that will be led. It's really hard to go to green pastures when you don't know where there are and you don't know how, you won't allow yourself to be led there. If you've never read the book, there's a book called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. It's a very small book. And if you'd like it, I have it somewhere in the back. And it's exactly what the title says. It's a shepherd writing about Psalm 23 and giving his own insights because he was a shepherd for so long. And one of the things he pointed out is that it broke his heart when sheep would not be led. Because these sheep, when they aren't led, not only get themselves into dangerous situations, but they lead other sheep into the dangerous situations. And unfortunately, there are times where for the sake of the entire flock, he would have to put a sheep to death. Because this one sheep was just stubborn. It wouldn't listen. It wouldn't be led. It wouldn't go to the green pastures or the still waters. These are all great blessings here written about God's people. He leads us to green pastures. He leads us to still waters, but he can't lead us if we're not willing to be led. If we don't let him lead us, we won't find these. We can try to find them on our own, but you won't find it. These are sheep also, I would like to point out, that enjoy the blessings of the shepherd. God gives us good things. And I want to be very careful not to come across as if I'm presenting a prosperity gospel. I'm not. But I do want you to notice that God gives good things to people and wants them to enjoy his blessings. That's okay. We don't have to feel bad about having good things. If our things become everything and we're just using God to get good things, then there's an issue. But to take something and rejoice in it because God gave it to us, there's nothing wrong with that. These are sheep that enjoy being by the green pastures and laying down in them. These are sheep that enjoy the still waters, the peace that comes with that. These are sheep that are enjoying the blessings of the shepherd. Now I want you to look at these places that the shepherd is guiding the sheep to. First of all, as I've said, they are good places. They're good places. Sometimes I think we don't believe this or we forget this. That God, the God we read about in the Bible, who tells us to do things that are maybe difficult to do, who tells us to do things that may make us stand out if we do them, is guiding us to good places, even if we can't see it in the moment. This shepherd guides his sheep to good places, to lie down in green pastures. He leads them to peaceful places. He leads them beside the still waters, places where there isn't anxiety, places where there isn't destruction, where there isn't chaos. And even, as we're going to see in verse 4, even if you're in the middle of anxiety and destruction and chaos, you can still have peace because of the shepherd. The shepherd leads us to good places, to peaceful places, to places that restore us. It's restorative places. He restores my soul. The essential part of you, the part of you that has life, that is eternal, is restored through the teachings and the guidance of God. And he leads us also to right places. The second part of verse 3, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He leads us to right places. Places where right and wrong divide, because there is a division between right and wrong, and he leads us down the right path. Now, all of this are things we have to keep in mind as we go into verse 4. It's not separate from it. Because the truth is that sometimes you have to go through verse 4 before you can get to verses 2 and 3. Or sometimes you have to leave verses 2 and 3 and then go to verse 4. But you wind up again in verses 2 and 3. You have to keep everything that I just said in mind as you come to verse 4. Otherwise, verse 4 will maybe even destroy us. Verse 4 will be a very unpleasant verse if you don't keep verses 1, 2, and 3 in mind as you read it. Let's move on then to verse 4. David writes, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." This idea here, it has been translated for many years as the valley of the shadow of death. If you're reading your Bible, may have a footnote. This is something like the valley of deep darkness or the valley of deep gloom. The valley of the shadow of death is a very poetic reading that we have kept, and I like that we've kept it, but a more accurate translation would be something like deep darkness or deep gloom. And this is a valley then that the sheep don't think the sheep are going astray here. They're still being led. This is what I mean by we have to keep in mind verses 1 through 3 as we go into verse 4. The sheep are still being led even in verse 4 through the valley of the shadow of death. And I want you to think about the image that the psalmist uses to present of this place. It's a valley of deep darkness. It is a darkness you cannot see the bottom of. It's a darkness that is much darker on the inside than it appears on the outside. It's much worse when you're in the middle of it than you are outside of it looking at it. This is the kind of place that the sheep are being led to. The sheep are also being led through a valley. Imagine for 1 second, you're walking down a ravine, a narrow ravine, with walls that just climb higher and higher as you go farther and farther down, and it just gets darker and darker. That's the image that's being presented here. This is a valley that goes over you, that overwhelms you, that is taking you down with it. The valley itself is a place that is designed to inspire dread and fear, to provoke that within us. And these are all meant, of course, to describe various trials and difficulties we go through, whether they're little or especially if they're large. Because when you're going through a difficult trial, as you go down, you imagine going into this valley, when you're at the bottom of the valley, all you can see is the valley. You can't see beyond the walls. You can't see what's going on outside of it. The valley becomes your whole world. And that's exactly what happens to people, especially the more difficult the trial is. The trial becomes your whole world. It becomes all you can think about. It becomes all that's going on. Your calendars are set based on this. Your phone is set based to this. You're receiving messages and emails from people dealing with this. It becomes your whole world. And the psalmist says that even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The reason this is so comforting is because God isn't outside the valley calling you back to him. He's walking through it with you. Even when this trial becomes your whole world, God enters into that world and goes through it with you. I hope you can start to see why this psalm has just helped and restored so many souls for so many centuries. We need to be reminded of this because it's easy to forget this. When the valley is our whole world, it's easy to forget this, that God is in there with us. Just like when the people went into captivity, when they were taken into exile and the temple is destroyed, and the Ark of the Covenant is gone. God still raises up Daniel. God still raises up Esther. God goes into captivity with them, even when the captivity became their whole world. And when this valley becomes our whole world, whatever that may be, God enters it with us. Now I want you to read how the sheep go through this valley. First of all, they go through it fearlessly. He says, I will fear no evil. Now, this isn't a fearlessness that is baseless. It's not like baseless confidence. This is a fearlessness that is rooted in the fact that the shepherd is going through it with you, and in verses 2 and 3, the shepherd has already demonstrated he's trustworthy. He has already demonstrated he takes you to green pastures. He has already demonstrated he leads you beside still waters. So that when you go through this valley, you don't fear anything because you know what's coming on the other side. More green pastures, more still waters. The sheep go through this first fearlessly, and second with the rod and the staff. He says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, I'm sure many of you are already aware that the rod and the staff are tools used to guide the sheep, to kind of maybe even discipline the sheep a little bit, to keep them in line. Because the truth is that when sheep are filled with fright, they scatter. They run. And the rod and the staff are meant to keep the sheep going so that the sheep are confident the shepherd knows where he's leading me. This is not an accident. It's not an accident I'm going through this valley. There's good coming out of this. I trust this shepherd. In many ways, the rod and the staff are used to keep the sheep just going straight. Which means if you're in the valley of the shadow of death, the way out is not climbing the sides. The way out is going straight through it. You think about for a moment Jesus in the garden before he's crucified. He prays to God that this cup would pass from him. And God uses the rod and the staff to tell him no, to keep him going straight to the cross. And sometimes for us, we need not to pray to get out of the valley. We need to pray to be able to go through the valley like Christians. Whatever comes out on the other side. Now there may be on the other side recovery. But this may actually be exactly what it sounds like, the valley of the shadow of death. What may be at the end of this is the end of our biological lives. And we need to pray not just for healing, although we should pray for healing, We should pray for comfort. We should pray for help. We are to pray for those things. But we should also not neglect praying to be able to go through the valley as a Christian would, as Christ did, without veering to the right or to the left, but going straight through it. Now this psalm, as I said, it has inspired so many people in so many generations because it's universal. If you have not yet gone through a valley of the shadow of the death, you will. There is no escaping this. There was a musician once, I remember, who, after his brother's son died, he wrote a song called Tragedies A-Comin', to try to prepare people. There's no escaping this. That was something he learned from this. You can't get out of it. There is no getting out of the valley of the shadow of death. But as we read this, we have to read this with all that we had read about the shepherd in mind, with this character of the shepherd, who he has demonstrated himself to be. He has demonstrated himself to be someone who leads the sheep to good places. That the valley of the shadow of death is intentional. I'm going to say that again. The valley of the shadow of death is intentional. And it's sometimes when you're in it, and this valley is your whole world, you can't possibly imagine why this is happening, how this is happening, how to get through it. But you can find comfort in knowing that you're being led through it, you're not going through it alone, and that you're being led to a good place, because this is the kind of shepherd who is leading you. The last two verses then in the psalm, David writes, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The psalmist then has started with a scene of the pasture, a shepherd and a sheep, but he then brings it back to what it means to be a person. And he brings it back to real terms, that the life of a person of God is meant to be spent living with God. This is how this is all summed up. This is how the life of God's people is summed up. He says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil." Right? We're not at the pasture anymore. The shepherd does not prepare tables for sheep to come and sit at, to drink tea, whatever. Shepherd doesn't do that. David brings it back to our world. And he says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." This can really go one of two ways. One is that it's like God is exalting a person in the presence of his enemies to say, this is my person, this is my son, this is my daughter. Or it could go a different way, which is that even in the presence of enemies, God prepares a table for his people, just as even in the valley of the shadow of death, God is with this person. You see, those are two slightly different ways to take this. And I don't know the exact right way. I think those are both two very valid interpretations. God prepares a table for his people, and then it says he anoints my head with oil, which some commentators think is probably a symbol of God inviting someone into his house. This is what happens in the ancient world. You invite someone over, you anoint them with oil. Because then he says, "And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." He says also in verse 6, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." These are things that come to us as well as fragrances we leave behind as we're being led by God. And the word mercy here is one of your vocab words from Ruth, which is chesed, which means something like loving kindness or steadfast love. Just as Ruth didn't leave Naomi, God will not leave his people. This is the kind of life that is depicted for all of God's people. The broad picture here, then, is that to live a life with God is to be led by God. That God's people are led by him day in and day out. They pray to him. They listen to him. They rejoice in his blessings. And even when they go through the valley of the shadow of death, they know that God is with them. Now, one of the beauties of this psalm, I think, is that you can either take it in order or you can take it out of order. As I said, if you almost have to know verses 2 and 3 before you read verse 4, because sometimes you have to go through verse 4 in order to go to verses 2 and 3. But if you also put it into order, you really begin to see, I think, another side to this that is equally valid, which is that at first there is a simplicity. We're led to green pastures. We're led beside still waters. And there's a joyful simplicity in our lives. But then there are things that come along that get very difficult. And sometimes it is the end of our biological life we are facing. But you'll notice that verse 4 is not the end of the psalm. It's the link between the simple pasture life to living in the house of the Lord forever. And I think that's intentional. The valley of the shadow of death, whatever it is, maybe it's a big trip coming up. Maybe it's the start of the school year. Maybe it's the trials you'll face in this school year, as there are going to be new sets of people you're going to meet, new difficulties you're going to face. Maybe it is a sickness, an illness. Whatever it is, know that, number one, God is going through it with you, and number two, it is only the link between a simple pasture life and one that is more full, where you live in the house of the Lord forever. And whether that's a fullness you receive now, because you can, I think trials shape us as gold is refined in the fire. They shape us to be people who can more appreciate what it is to live in the presence of God. These trials can shape us, and we can live more fully in the presence of God now, or these trials may be the end. But that will only, again, link you to living in the house of the Lord forever. It is not the end of everything. This psalm has comforted and guided people for centuries. And it's not just because they're pretty words, it's because they're true words. God is like a shepherd. Even he says that. He does guide us. He does take care of us. He does lead us to good places. And he will lead us through difficult places. But as we go through these difficult times, we know that the difficult times are filled also with the presence of God, even when those become our entire world. And we know that the difficult times are not the end. They are only the link that will then lead you into the house of the Lord, to being welcomed by God, and to living in a way that is much more full, much more real, much more designed by God, that we should always live in his presence. Now, if you're here this morning and you would like to be baptized, we can do that. If you're here and you would like to study, or you have any questions at all about anything that has been said throughout this entire service, please talk to one of us. If you would like prayers please request that of us. We would be very happy to pray with you. If there's anything at all that we can do, please make your need known now while we stand and sing the invitation song.